Okay, colleagues, so hello and welcome to the 2020 Philosophy of Science course. This is the online version of the first introductory lecture. So today I want to talk about the course in general, lay out the main topics, but most importantly, I guess, is to give you a feel for the general approach that we are going to be taking in this course. And since there are technically no prerequisites for taking this course, I will try to be as explicit as possible. So let us begin at the very beginning. The name of the course is Philosophy and Methodology of the Natural and the Social Sciences. Now, I interpret this title in a very broad sense. So basically, I want to take the most basic, the most fundamental questions that humanity has been able to come up with, and to try to address them using the best, the most advanced, cutting-edge techniques in all of the branches of human knowledge that are available to us in the 21st century. Which is, admittedly, a very ambitious task. And while I'm not saying that we'll be able to answer every question definitively, by the end of this course, which is supposed to be about 18 lectures or so, you shall be equipped with the basic tools, with the basic scaffolding necessary to make inroads, to deal with these questions, at least in a preliminary way. And then, hopefully, to continue building upon these insights, even after you have completed this course. So, where shall we begin? There are indeed many possible starting locations one could choose, but I'd say one especially fruitful place to start is with what Kant identifies as the three basic questions. What can I know? What should I do? What can I hope for? And Kant says that these three basic questions can be reduced to a fourth one, namely, what is a human being? Now, immediately you can see that my interpretation of the course is very practical, at least by philosophical standards. So, very practical and very anthropocentric, very human-oriented. Again, what can I know? What should I do? What can I hope for? And the question number 4 is basically, what am I? So indeed, the ancient Greeks, the founders of the Western philosophical tradition, the Greeks, by and large, shared this practical attitude to philosophy, in a sense that, for the Greeks, philosophy was supposed to be therapeutic. Philosophy was supposed to do for the soul what medicine does to the body. And I have to say, I very much share this outlook, and I also want to maintain it throughout the course. Now, these 4 Kantian questions, the way I propose to map them onto this course, Philosophy of Science, is to confront the 4th question directly. What is a human being? Or in other words, to try to offer something like a basic methodological reconstruction of our modern scientific picture, from protons to presidents and from electrons to elections, to use John Searle's expression. That is to say, we're going to ask, what is a human being? How do we fit into our best contemporary picture of the universe as a whole? How do we reconcile our basic experience of living a conscious, deliberate, meaningful, free, rational life with our best account of the fundamental constituents of physical reality as mindless, meaningless, blind, deterministic energy fluctuations in the quantum fields? In a deep sense, that's going to be our main objective in this course. And I shall give a more detailed preview of this project towards the end of today's lecture. Now, before I do that, let me go back to the 4 Kantian questions and to my essentially practical way of defining the main task of philosophy. Let me try to bring this closer to home, so to speak. So I would say that philosophy, the way I understand it, begins with a very particular, very peculiar experience. And I should also say, I think it is a very rare experience. I would describe it as a pause, as a suspension of the regular course of events, as an interruption in the usual state of affairs, a timeout or a pause, whereby an individual, so to speak, takes a break from the rush of everyday life and asks themselves, what are they doing and why are they doing it? So, phenomenologically speaking, that is to say, from the standpoint of our inner experience, we wake up in the morning often to an alarm clock, always short on time, always rushing somewhere. Taking a break in this sense is actually, I think, an enormous luxury. And what makes this break philosophical is not merely the state of idleness, but a state of reflection. I mean, again, the vast majority of people, when they do take a break, because they're tired or depressed, they are in no mood and in no position to reflect attentively and carefully on their situation. So if one were to take a pause and reflect, what would they find? Let me make a very strong claim. This claim is largely due to the great German philosopher Martin Heidegger, whom we'll study later in the course. So Heidegger would say that the fundamental experience of our human existence is an experience of groundlessness and anxiety. In the following sense, all of our experience is essentially structured in a temporal fashion. We are, so to speak, tied between the past and the future. And if we reflect on our temporal situation, again carefully and attentively, we will realize that what we have in the past is not a clear or a transparent point of departure or origin, but something vague, indeterminate, indefinite, amorphous. As Brian McGee puts it, we always already find ourselves emerging from the unconsciousness of an earlier period in time. So if I think back and ask myself, why am I standing here and recording this lecture? I remember having emerged from the unconsciousness of today's early morning, presumably from the unconsciousness of sleep, but also from a different perspective. In a broader sense, I always already find myself emerging from the unconsciousness of early babyhood, always already finding myself thrown into this world, always already finding myself with certain beliefs, certain desires, finding myself in a certain body with particular dispositions, but also, very importantly, finding myself without a manual, without a clear instruction as to what I should do. Now, to be sure, people will claim that this or that book or this or that person has it all figured out. But these quote-unquote manuals come without a factory stamp, so to speak, in a sense that it is always a matter of our free conscious choice to accept, let's say, a particular teaching as authoritative. But such choice always remains provisional, always open to revision. And in this sense, our existence is always an issue for us. We cannot choose to not care about our existence. And again, as to the particular choices that we make, if we're honest with ourselves, we know that these choices were our choices, which is to say that we could have chosen otherwise. And there's always bound to be a lingering doubt on whether we have made the right choice or not. But even more dramatically, about these choices, if we do ask ourselves why we have made a certain particular choice, at the end of the day, the real answer is unknown to us. So again, I am recording this lecture. But why am I recording it? I could give you a story that giving lectures is an essential part of my vocation as a professional philosopher. Maybe I find it enjoyable. Maybe being a university professor gives one a certain measure of social esteem. But why do I care about esteem? Or why do I find philosophy pleasurable? At some point, the answer boils down to just, this is the situation I find myself in. These are the dispositions I find myself with. But I don't have the slightest idea as to why. A very disconcerting fact indeed. So this is the universal experience of groundlessness that Heidegger points to. Parenthetically, let me just mention that I think that to some extent this captures the timeless appeal of Plato's dialogues. Socrates goes around Athens, often talking to successful, highly esteemed citizens, and Socrates asks them to give an account of their life. And time again, especially in the so-called aporetic, allegedly early dialogues, the Athenians find themselves driven into a corner, unable to respond, forced to agree with Socrates' disconcerting conclusion that he knows nothing, and neither do they. But it gets even worse, because we were just talking about time. So there's a point in the past, but obviously there's also a point in the future. So what does future hold? Well, we all live in a shadow, in the expectation of death. Death, this interesting and strange word. A word which seemingly refers to something that can never truly be a part of our experience. In a sense that if I am truly dead, there is no me to experience this death. But, of course, in an indirect fashion, I see, often tragically and lamentably, other people die. And in general, there is something akin to death in the mere passage of time. Plants, animals, people getting old, getting sick, dying. Artifacts getting worn out, old, broken. And in a general sense, moments of time irretrievably passing away. So this, according to Heidegger, is our fundamental experience, strung between indeterminate groundlessness of the past and the indeterminate anxiety in the future, without a clear point of departure and without a clear destination. And maybe most importantly, without a manual, without a map or a compass. In many ways, an awesome challenge. And I would say that to do philosophy essentially is to take up this challenge. To have the courage to think for yourself. Not to rely on shortcuts or cop-outs. Not to lose ourselves in the busyness of everyday life. But to look squarely at these questions and to try our best to provide adequate answers to these questions, in full realization of the limited nature of human knowledge and of human cognition, understanding that at best one can provide only a tentative answer, necessarily open to criticism and subject to revision. Let us go back and once again meditate on Kant's 4 questions. Hopefully now they will make slightly more sense. What should I do? What can I know? What can I hope for? The 3 questions reducible to the 4th, most fundamental question. What am I? Now, how does science fit into all this? Now, one way to understand what science is, essentially, is not to look for a formal definition, but to take what one may call a sociological or an anthropological perspective. Science is a human enterprise. It is a human activity, operating and evolving according to intersubjective rules. To use Wittgenstein's metaphor, it is a kind of a game, or maybe akin to a game. There are rules. Rules are made by humans, like the rules of football or basketball. But notice that even though these rules are made by humans, they are not really arbitrary. For example, they cannot be changed on a whim, and also cannot be changed in a one-sided fashion. There's an important element of social consensus behind them. Now, in general, I have to say that I personally hold this kind of anthropological approach, if you want, in very high esteem. this way of looking at things is going to be highly important throughout this course. So I would make a strong claim that one cannot really point to a formal definition of scientific enterprise, and instead we humans, human culture, reserves the name of science as a seal of approval or as a badge of honor to those disciplines or systems of disciplines which appear to us to have the highest degree of certainty, to the kinds of theories that performed the best in terms of the verification procedures that our culture has come up with. Now, as I said, I like this way of looking at things, but I should also warn you that this is a controversial definition, and many scientists and many philosophers of science will not share it. And also, highly controversially, from the standpoint of this definition, there is absolutely no interesting difference or no interesting essential difference between science, philosophy, religion, morality, politics. So I would say, for example, that the difference between science and religion, according to this way of looking at things, is ultimately that there is an incomparably higher degree of consensus in what we call hard sciences, compared, for example, to the major branches of the major world religions. Science and scientists tend to agree, though not always, but much more, I could even say incomparably more, and actually maybe even agree for qualitatively different reasons than, for example, the major traditions of the major world religions, which disagree in essential ways between each other. And moreover, it's not even exactly clear how one would adjudicate between different religions, let's put it that way. Which brings me to an important next point, which is this. I sometimes find that students have this misleading impression that whereas science and philosophy are fundamentally uncertain, religion is somehow radically different in the sense that it is immune to these kinds of uncertainties and, so to speak, provides something like a shortcut to truth. Now, I think it's actually quite easy to demonstrate in a fairly straightforward fashion that this position is completely untenable, if I may use that phrase. And the reason, which I've actually already alluded to, is very simple. The major religious traditions disagree. In crucial respect, disagree among each other. And not only that, but even within any particular given tradition, we can see how the dominant interpretations, first of all, change with time, and secondly, maybe even more importantly, take, I don't know, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Confucianism, or what have you. All the major traditions have various competing interpretations. To take just one example, think for a moment how many denominations of Christianity exist. 5, 10, 20? Well, actually, latest sociological research tells us that there are 40,000 denominations of Christianity, approximately. And I'm sure there are new denominations appearing almost daily. And I'm sure that many, if not most of these denominations, believe that their interpretation of the Bible is the only correct one, and everybody else is basically going to hell. So basically, if one chooses to trust this priest, or this book, or this prophet, one has to be able to give a certain rational account as to why they prefer this particular branch and not some other. So in exactly the same fashion that scientific theories require justification, religious worldviews require justification as well. And so, in some sense, if one wants to be a good religious person, one first has to be a good philosopher. And if one digs deeper, there are problems upon problems with religious worldview in general. Without going into detail now, let me just mention one. So most religions rely on a particular canon of a body of ancient sacred writing. But immediately the problem is that the originals of these texts like the Bible or the Quran or the Vedas, are lost, and the languages in which they were written are, technically speaking, dead. Not to mention that I think, strictly speaking, these texts were only supposed to record the original oral tradition. And this transition from spoken word to writing is deeply problematic in its own right, for reasons I don't want to go into right now. But in any case, it is now very much a matter of deliberate conscious choice. Which texts should we consider sacred? How to translate them? And more importantly, how to interpret them? And again, I think it's crucially important to remember that religious texts do not interpret themselves. The Bible, for instance, does not have a theory of the Bible, or the Quran, the theory of the Quran. And what I mean by this is that there is no separate chapter in these books, a chapter that, again, to repeat myself, would explain who wrote this book and why, which texts or which verses are supposed to be included. Again, remember that different Christians would include different books in the Bible, and in general some guidelines as to how the sacred text should be read and understood. Now, maybe that's too much to ask, but I mean, after all, we could imagine a different world in which a given sacred text would project its meaning, so to speak, directly into the head of the believer, such that there is no misunderstanding and no controversy. But that is very obviously not what happens in our world. Notice also that the Quran or the Christian New Testament or the Hebrew Bible are actually not the oldest religious texts in existence. For example, historians tell us that the Rig Veda predates the Bible by maybe something on the order of 1,000 years. And I think in a very important sense, one has to ask that if we allow, in principle, for miraculous sources of knowledge, if we allow for the possibility of disclosure of truth directly through divine revelation, through a connection of an individual human intellect to the mind of God or goddess or some kind of other divine figure, how is it possible that there are many revelations and that they differ from one another? One natural answer would be that, so to speak, human intellect is imperfect at receiving revelation, and whereas divinity, that is, God or gods, do not make mistakes, but human prophets who record the revelations can make mistakes. Well then, but how do you know which portion of religious texts are true and which are mistaken? In that case, you would kinda need science, or some other form of independent verification, to tell you what is true about Rig Veda or the Quran, which would kinda make the religious text superfluous and unnecessary. Wouldn't you agree? Or at any rate, to the extent that one decides at the end of the day to be religious, one first has to establish their religious conviction in a philosophical or a scientific fashion. So the upshot is the exact reverse of the thesis from which we began. It is patently not the case. Science is uncertain, but religion is certain. In fact, it seems to be exactly the other way around. Religion is completely uncertain, unless it is independently grounded in some form of science. As an afterthought, let me also mention one other thing. Of course, religious people very often talk about faith, how you're supposed to have faith as opposed to relying on clear and certain proof. Faith, in the eyes of uncertainty, would then be seen as something admirable, praiseworthy, leap of faith in the dark. But again, if one looks around and asks about themselves or about other people they know, why are they themselves religious? The story is often extremely mundane. For the vast majority of people, they are religious because of their immediate social environment. Their parents, most often. So, far from being admirable, seems to be a fairly pedestrian reason. Now, again, let me underscore that I'm not trying to be offensive. I'm not trying to undermine religion or religious faith. If one, having examined all the arguments, at the end of the day decides to be religious, that's perfectly fine. And of course, any rational person starting out the inquiry should be open to the possibility of all the outcomes under consideration. Seems like a basic rule of logic or rationality. So in no way am I trying to be anti-religious. I'm just trying to stress that there's a certain primacy of philosophy vis-a-vis religion, rooted in a very simple fact that one has to choose to be religious in a particular way. And there's nothing obvious or automatic about this choice. And note also that the refusal to make a choice usually means that others make this choice for you. Or to put it differently, if you do not think for yourself, others think for you. And some people may find that okay, but students I talk to usually don't. Is that a knockdown argument? Well, for better or for worse, philosophers don't really trade in knockdown arguments. Okay, so finally, let's talk about the modern scientific worldview. One is tempted to begin by asking a question: is there really such a thing? A single, unified scientific worldview? And although this question is obviously highly controversial, and the word science itself is incredibly value-laden, often used in a judgmental fashion, but still, I want to propose a certain tentative way of summarizing the key assumptions and principles that do indeed seem to underlie our contemporary scientific picture. And at the end of the day, the assumptions and the principles that allow the representatives of the various branches of knowledge to talk to one another. So I would try to summarize this in terms of maybe 5 different ideas. Before I do that, let me once again remind us of the programmatic statement, so to speak, behind the whole approach. So again, as John Searle, among others, says, the overriding task of philosophy today is to explain how our entire view of the world holds together. Primarily and most importantly, how do human beings fit into our contemporary scientific worldview? That is, how do we reconcile our picture of basic reality as made up of meaningless, mindless particles in the fields of force, or maybe fluctuations in the quantum fields? How do we reconcile this basic meaninglessness with our picture of ourselves as mindful, meaningful, free, rational individuals searching for a deeper meaning or purpose behind their existence? Or, put differently, how do we construct a unified picture of the world from protons to presidents and from electrons to elections? And so let me begin by summarizing the 5 ideas that I want to propose. These 5 are skepticism, naturalism, mechanicism, evolution, and number 5 is less of an idea and more of a question of meaning. Let me try to go through all 5 in less than a sentence each. So again, 1. Skepticism, 2. Naturalism, 3. Mechanicism, 4. Evolution, 5. The practical question of meaning. Number 1. Skepticism. Human knowledge is radically limited, never final, and always open to revision. And though we can never get to the truth with a capital T, science somehow appears to be the best option that we have available to us. Number 2. Naturalism may be defined as opposed to supernaturalism. It's the basic assumption that miracles do not happen, that we live in a single world, unified by a single, exceptionless set of laws of nature, a set of laws that govern everything from protons to presidents. In fact, the more complex phenomena being explicable in terms of the simpler phenomena. So if you want, presidents behave the way they do because protons behave the way they do. To elaborate just a bit further, on this picture there's only one basic science. Our best, though not final, candidate for this science would be something like the modern quantum field theory, which underlies the current standard model of particle physics. And then all the other sciences would build on top of it in a hierarchical fashion, each science on this increasing level of complexity simply representing a kind of a heuristic, schematic oversimplification of the behavior of the ensemble of the underlying elementary particles. So on this picture, chemistry would be a higher level heuristic description of the emergent properties of basic physics. So again, chemistry on top of physics, then let's say organic chemistry just being a branch of chemistry, biology a subset of organic chemistry, building on top of organic chemistry, and then on the basis of biology, we see the emergence of what I would describe as two parallel processes or two parallel domains. One of them, the domain of group dynamics, interactions between individual organisms, and individual psychology. So the reason I prefer to talk about them in parallel is because apparently they develop in parallel. Group dynamics influences individual psychology, and individual psychology in turn influences the group dynamics. And so when talking about the human beings, these two domains, broadly speaking, give us social theory and cognitive science. So this was the second idea, which I called naturalism, and I wanted to emphasize this assumption of the unity of science that underlies it. Now, idea number 3 I called mechanicism. So mechanicism in this sense is supposed to be contrasted with teleology. Teleology comes from the Greek word telos, which means aim or purpose or goal. The idea being that mechanicism is anti-teleological. Mechanicism, again, is a worldview that existed since ancient times and became increasingly important since the scientific revolution. The idea that at a fundamental level in nature, there are no aims, no purposes, no goals, and most importantly, no values. And that the behavior of the constituent elements of reality, be it atoms or particles or quantum fluctuations, that this behavior is explicable in terms of blind, deterministic, mathematical regularity. And again, to bring this closer to home, the idea number 2, naturalism, tells us that we simply are collections of particles. Nothing else, nothing on top of that. Among other things, that there's no such thing as free will. And idea number 3 says that these particles are essentially meaningless. And so, again, there is no sense in which, objectively speaking, anything in the universe would be good or evil in and of itself. And so humans have a certain relative and subjective way of talking about justice or goodness, but on a fundamental level, nothing really is just or good in and of itself. Let me also elaborate a bit further on this issue of teleological versus mechanistic worldview. Now, even though both options, as far as we can tell, have existed more or less since the dawn of human intellectual history, meaning that you can find traces of teleological and mechanistic approaches in the earliest philosophers of whom we know anything, still, it seems that the teleological approach was in a certain sense dominant. And I think it stands to reason. Within the teleological picture, there's a certain understanding that everything that happens in the world happens for a reason. Now, teleological philosophies are often theological, although they don't have to be. So, for example, in certain versions of Platonism, there are objective values, but these objective values exist over and above, but more importantly, independently of the divine realm. But still, to go back to this point, within the teleological worldview, if you have a pimple on your forehead, or a splinter in your toe, or, Jupiter forbid, your loved one dies, there is a certain reason or a purpose why this happened, and indeed why this had to happen. Whereas in the mechanistic worldview, the world is just a random jumbling of particles. And yes, maybe there are causes, but not reasons. So in the mechanistic worldview, you can imagine, let's say, a meteor flying from outer space and destroying something that is valuable to you. And there need not be any reason or any moral as to why that happens. So maybe a superintelligence, the proverbial Laplacian demon, could have predicted, maybe at the moment of the Big Bang, that the meteor will strike on this particular day. So in this sense, there may be a mathematical explanation, but not a moral reason not a justification as to why this had to happen. You just got unlucky. And in this sense, again, in the traditional teleological worldview, there was this notion that there's a certain harmony that exists in the world above, maybe instantiated in the perfect motion of the celestial bodies. And this heavenly perfect order somehow guides and steers everything that happens down here on Earth. But beginning with Copernicus, through Galileo, Kepler, and most importantly Newton, this beautiful teleological picture was gradually completely dismantled. So much so that for Newton, it is exactly one and the same law of gravity that makes the apple fall down from a tree and makes the moon circle the earth. And not only that, but the moon affects me, but also I affect the moon. And the only difference is quantitative. The moon is simply more massive. And notice also that this mathematical law, Newton's law of gravity, makes it the case that there is nothing special about the circular orbits of the planets. In fact, if you let the planets run their course, at some point in the future, and I think Newton had noticed this himself, the planets are bound to either just fly apart or crash into one another. Either way, on the mechanistic picture, the appearance of order or harmony is always transient and fragile. And indeed, on the standard contemporary cosmological picture, the universe will end in a deeply unsatisfying way, with this state of maximum entropy usually referred to as the heat death of the universe. All the matter in the universe decaying, disintegrating, finally the black holes evaporating through Hawking radiation, leaving nothing but quantum foam, the tiny fluctuations in the vacuum states of the quantum fields. Many people, probably most, find this picture deeply disconcerting and depressing, and one, I think, is very much tempted to somehow reject this picture and to try to go back to the old teleological worldview. But to do philosophy, I think, very importantly, is to resist that temptation. I think there's this obvious tendency of normal human psychology towards wishful thinking, towards believing certain things only because it makes us more comfortable. And I think we have to keep this tendency in mind, and therefore to take the mechanistic picture and its challenge very seriously, and to work against this wishful thinking tendency of our psychology, and to try to stand by to work through the mechanistic picture, and to doubt or to question it only if we have a good reason to do so. And though I think we should always be open to such a possibility, let me parenthetically note that I am not optimistic about this prospect, in a sense that I believe that the mechanistic picture is here to stay, and rather than trying to refute it, our time and effort is better spent trying to understand it and to understand its implications. Okay, so now within this naturalistic framework, let me again circle back to this question: what is a human being? And let me finally provide a kind of a tentative answer. And in my own words, I would give a following formulation. Human beings are anxious, mostly unconscious, products of larger forces of biological and cultural evolution, manufactured by these forces, not to be happy, but in order to fulfill a certain function within the logic of perpetuation of these systems of biological and cultural evolution. We want things that we do not need, and the things that we really need we cannot, in principle, get. Now we'll have an occasion to discuss the details of this description, but let me now just try to draw your attention to a certain way of looking at human behavior. So imagine, you wake up in the morning, you lie in the bed, and you're about to get up. What is it that makes you get up? And again, as a tentative first pass, let me suggest that we could say that there are three kinds of things that make you get out of bed in the morning. And these would be your beliefs, your values, and your desires. So let's say I believe something to be true. I hold certain things to be good, just, worthy, dignified. And I also desire certain things. I find them pleasurable, attractive. Now let's pause and ask this potentially disconcerting question. Why do I believe what I believe? Why do I want what I want? And why do I value what I value? And in a deep sense, I think the preliminary answer that we have to give is that I don't know. I always already find myself with certain beliefs, values, and desires, but their origin lies beyond my experience. I mean, obviously, sometimes people choose. They choose what to believe, but they choose it on the basis of things which they assume to be true. Or people, let's say, choose what to buy, but they choose it on the basis of what they already want or value. So it's like, yes, we do make choices, but we make choices on the basis of our dispositions, more fundamental dispositions that we do not choose. And one of the big topics of this course would be to examine the origin of our beliefs, values, and desires. And again, as always, conclusions up front. According to our best contemporary understanding, it appears that there's a certain evolutionary story that has to do with the processes of biological and cultural natural selection, such that at the end of the day, not only is it that we do not know why we want the things we want, but we actually want them for some completely extraneous, mechanistic, in some sense maybe even random reason that has to do with the accidental history or genealogy, if you want, of our genes and other processes of broadly speaking similar nature. And again, I think it's important that in this course we try to give a certain account of how our beliefs, desires, and values come about, and also, given this account, what should we do about them? So again, we keep circling between these Kantian questions, the question of what am I, somehow leading into the question of what I should do. Okay, there's obviously more to be said, but I think we covered a lot of ground already. So maybe we should take it easy, start slow, let the new ideas sink in. So, I mean, I personally find all these ideas to be extremely fascinating, and I very much look forward to continue this discussion with all of you throughout the semester. So, best of luck to us on our journey, and I will see you next time. And until then, take care.